Since 1999, Sylvester McCoy has played the Doctor in more than 100 Big Finish audio dramas. Over the past few months, I've been listening to a particular run of stories released between 2004 and 2010, in which the Seventh Doctor is travelling with Sophie Aldred as Ace and Philip Olivier as Hex. Towards the end of the run, it starts to tie in with the Sixth Doctor and Evelyn stories that I reviewed a few months ago, so you may want to listen to those first. But either way, it's a fantastic set of stories and really shows the variety and imagination of Doctor Who at its best. First is The Harvest by Dan Abnett. This is a good jumping on point for the range. Released in 2004, it introduces the character of Hex, alias Thomas Hector Schofield, who is a Liverpudlian nurse working in London in 2021. The near-future setting is unusual for a companion introduction, and it allows him to have more contemporary references than someone like Ace, who was from the 1980s. For the Doctor and Ace, a few years have passed in survival. Ace is now a seasoned time traveller, and you get the impression that she's probably in her mid-20s, around the same age as Hex. Each of the 4 episodes has a different tone. Part 1 is mostly from Hex's perspective, as he goes about his shift at the hospital and encounters Ace, who's calling herself McShane and working in HR. They investigate sinister goings-on on a secret floor of the hospital, ending with Hex entering the TARDIS. This came out a year before Rose was broadcast, and it works in a similar way, foregrounding the companion and initially treating the Doctor as a mystery, but that's probably just a coincidence. Part 2 has the Doctor recruiting Hex to infiltrate the hospital, so there is something of a spy feel as Ace and Hex sneak around, while the Doctor has some amusing scenes running rings around the artificial intelligence systems. At the end, the threat is revealed, and it's the Cybermen, which would have been a spoiler at the time, but it's been out for more than 20 years now, so it's probably safe. Part 3 has Ace captured and in deadly danger, and the Doctor explains the story of the Cybermen to Hex, and he starts to feel like a proper companion. Well, Part 4 is the big action climax, as the Cybermen run rampant through the hospital, and Hex decides to join the TARDIS team at the end. There are some interesting ideas brought up along the way. The Cybermen try to become human again, and get transplanted back into organic bodies. It turns out to be a trick eventually, but they do seem sympathetic for a time. The near-future setting, which is now really an alternate past, is mainly conveyed by playing techno music between scenes. It's not entirely to my taste, but it's much better than what Kev McCulloch was doing in some of his 7th Doctor TV stories. Apparently the story is part of a trilogy, involving 5th and 6th Doctor stories, but it's perfectly understandable on its own. Sylvester McCoy plays it rather quaintly to start with, but in the final part he has some strong speeches when confronting the Cyber Leader. Sophie Aldred gives a bright, confident performance. This is clearly an older version of Ace, but not the battle-hardened soldier from the New Adventures novels. She's a lot more positive and well-rounded. And Philip Olivier's Hex is instantly likeable, just an ordinary bloke thrown into all this chaos and finding he enjoys the excitement. So it's a good start to the run and very much recommended. Dreamtime shows Hex's first trip in the TARDIS, and it's got a unique setting. A lifeless city floating in space, with its inhabitants all turned to stone. It's an intriguing setup, but sadly the rest of the story doesn't really live up to it. As the Doctor, Ace and Hex explore the city, they find it also contains Uluru, which used to be known as Ayers Rock. You would think it would be visible from anywhere in the city, but apparently not. There are also monsters lurking in the shadows, sometimes called bunyips, sometimes rainbow serpents. It's unclear if they're meant to be the same thing. The first cliffhanger comes when the Doctor is turned to stone, and his disembodied mind finds itself in the Dreamtime, the collective unconsciousness of Aboriginal mythology. From there, he somehow goes back to Uluru before it was removed from Earth, and tries to prevent it from leaving there in the first place. While this is going on, Ace and Hex meet other visitors to the city, the lizard-like Galliari, who are looking to trade. These scenes are hard to listen to, as the actors' voices are treated electronically, like most aliens in Big Finish, so it's rather hard to understand what they're talking about. The soundscape does a lot to evoke the Australian setting. There's lots of didgeridoos and traditional music playing throughout, so it certainly stands out in that regard. Unfortunately, the guest actors do not appear to be Australian themselves, just English actors put in accents, which does rather spoil the authenticity. Sylvester McCoy's Doctor is a lot more positive and upbeat than he was in the last audio, though he does get some of his usual impassioned speeches when trying to persuade the Aboriginal elders to save more people, and he gets to play some sort of evil spirit who takes on the Doctor's form, so he clearly has some fun with that. Ace is also very cheerful in this one. She's shown to have some familiarity with guns, but she never explicitly mentions having been a soldier, so it's not clear whether this takes place before or after the New Adventures novels. Hex has the most development of the regulars, getting to see space for the first time and meeting his first aliens. It's just a shame it's not in a better story. This is not one of Big Finish's best by any means. The story is rather muddled and confusing. I was struggling to follow it by the end and was quite relieved when it was finally over. None of the characters are particularly interesting, and it's full of mystical spiritual nonsense that makes absolutely no sense. Definitely one to skip. Live 34 is one of those rare Doctor Who audios that doesn't just try to slavishly recreate the TV show, but it takes full advantage of the audio medium in a series of fictional radio broadcasts. This sort of thing has been done before in podcasts such as Within the Wires and Welcome to Night Vale, but Big Finish doesn't do this sort of thing nearly enough, and they really should. The setting is Colony 34, a distant planet in the far future. Part 1 is a whole news broadcast introducing us to the background of this world, with protests against the reign of Premier Jaeger, who has been ruling for 20 years, and is clearly a corrupt dictator. The TARDIS crew are nowhere to be heard until the Doctor appears and assumes the role of leader of the opposition party. The rest of the story covers the next few weeks before the election, which is a much longer period than Doctor Who stories traditionally cover, allowing events to play out over a more realistic time frame. Part 2 is in the form of a documentary, as one of the reporters goes in search of the mysterious rebel queen, who unsurprisingly turns out to be Ace, and further crimes of the regime are uncovered along the way. It really helps to flesh out this world, which turns out to be a very dark place to live indeed. Part 3 has another reporter, embedded with the paramedic by the name of Hex. He's not in this much, but we do get a bit more of his background to flesh him out, as he bonds with the reporter, and it all ties back into the main story at the end. Part 4 brings everything to a head, as it seems Jaeger is triumphant, with Ace captured and forced into denouncing her allies in one of Sophie Aldred's better moments. But the Doctor manages to turn it all around with a magnificent speech exposing the Premier's most deadly crimes. Sylvester McCoy is full of righteous anger, and it's a fine end to the story. The production throughout is excellent, with sound effects bringing the radio broadcast to life in convincing fashion, plus there's fine performances from the regulars, and William Pickup is eminently hateable as Premier Jaeger. It's all scarily believable, and echoes what has happened in dictatorial regimes throughout human history, particularly in regard to the censorship of broadcast media. One of the best Big Finish audios I've heard in a long time. Night Thoughts is a horror story, set in a deserted island with a small cast of characters who keep dying one by one. These kinds of stories always work well on audio. It doesn't take much to create a creepy atmosphere, but sadly the confusion is rather ambiguous and leaves you with more questions than answers. The Doctor, Ace and Hex land on a remote Scottish island and join a group of researchers on a retreat. All of them have secrets, there's stuffed animals everywhere, a teenage girl who only talks through a creepy toy rabbit with a very disturbing voice, and a mysterious hooded figure creeping about whistling oranges and lemons. It's all wonderfully spooky, and that's before people start dying. It's a typical slasher movie setup. Obviously none of the regulars are going to be killed off, but they're in danger frequently. Hex is locked in the freezer, Ace gets stuck in a bear trap. They're developing a nice camaraderie now that comes from saving each other's lives every week. Over the course of the drama, we learn that everything that happens is connected to the death of a woman and her daughter 10 years earlier, as well as a time travel experiment, so there's a lot going on. Unfortunately, it doesn't quite stick the landing, offering several alternative explanations for what's going on, but never quite settling on any. The X-Files can get away with that sort of thing, but with Doctor Who, you expect something a bit more definitive. And the final scene delivers yet another twist, with something completely nonsensical happening that never comes remotely close to being explained. It's a shame, really, as it was a decent story up to then. The setting is a pure historical story, taking the Doctor, Ace and Hex back to Ireland in the 1640s, a time when Oliver Cromwell was leading an army that slaughtered anybody who wouldn't surrender to it. And it's a particularly brutal story that would never have been broadcast on the TV show. For once, the Doctor is the one who immediately wants to leave, once he finds out when and where they are, but Ace and Hex vote to stay and try to help the doomed townspeople. The Doctor ends up taking care of a pregnant woman and helping her give birth. He makes a change with this Doctor to take on a softer, more caring role, but his usual fieriness comes out when the baby is threatened later on. Meanwhile, Hex meets up with Oliver Cromwell and tries to persuade him to stop his murderous campaign. Clive Mantle plays Cromwell. He's been in everything from Robin of Sherwood to Game of Thrones, and he gives a stand-up performance here, ordering the deaths of thousands while struggling with doubts about whether he's doing the right thing. He may be the villain of the piece, but he's a complex character, and the play certainly gets that across. Hex is really put through the mill in this story, starting out with all kinds of idealistic notions about helping people and trying to stop the war, but eventually coming to the conclusion that he has to fight himself. So it definitely feels like a real coming of age for the character. Unusually, there is a framing device where Ace and Hex console each other in the TARDIS after it's all over. These scenes are really effective, as we don't usually get to see them just talking quietly to each other, and it greatly enhances our understanding of these characters. Hex clearly has a huge crush on Ace, and even asks her to leave the TARDIS with him, but she just thinks of him as a little brother. I'm not sure how old either of them are meant to be at this point, but it's probably for the best. Romances between characters are very difficult to pull off. But it's all very effective, contrasting their emotional scenes together with the brutality of the war scenes. And it's a very strong story altogether. No Man's Land is the second war-based historical story in a row. Thankfully, this has a different focus and takes place slightly apart from the events of the war. The Doctor, Ace and Hex wake up in a hospital during the First World War. Only none of the soldiers there seem to have anything wrong with them, and they receive a mysterious message ordering them to solve a murder that hasn't even happened yet. It's a great premise, and the discovery that the inmates are undergoing psychological experiments certainly adds to it, with Hex captured and brainwashed early on. Unfortunately, it doesn't sustain the momentum, it slows down a lot in the middle, and the promising time travel elements all turn out to have a rational explanation. It does pick up in the last part with a final confrontation in the church in the middle of No Man's Land, and it hints that this whole organisation is an early version of the Forge from the 6th Doctor audios that I reviewed earlier in the year, but that feels very much like a last-minute addition. The guest cast are a little hard to tell apart, as they're all men, and most are affecting upper-class accents. The exception is Michael Cochrane as Lieutenant Commander Brooke. He's very good at playing these aristocratic officer types, and it's not too surprising when he turns out to be the mastermind behind these experiments. His cat and mouse scenes with Sylvester McCoy's Doctor are probably the best part of the story, with each trying to outmaneuver the other. Overall, it's an interesting instalment, but not really essential. Nocturne is a return to science fiction, but not a particularly strong one. It's set in a planet close to a war zone, where music and art are thriving, like Paris or Venice in the mid-20th century. Unlike the last two stories, the war is just a minor part, and in the end it's just background for a rather standard story with an ill-defined threat. The first part is almost entirely free of danger for a change, with the Doctor showing Ace and Hex around the planet. The three of them have a great rapport, and it's fun to hear them in a more relaxed setting, just larking around and teasing each other like a proper friend group. After that, a mysterious force starts killing people, and it's back to business as usual. Hex stumbles upon a murder scene, Ace gets a love interest, and the Doctor suspects that the colony's robots are responsible. Which is not unfair, as that does happen a lot. The actual culprit is more of an abstract force. It's not clear if it has any actual physical presence, but as a sound effect, it's really nothing special. There is a strong scene where the Doctor apologises to Ace for not telling her everything. It's beautifully played by Sylvester McCoy and Sophie Aldred, and it has been a long time coming. There are only 5 guest characters, which means the world feels rather small. 3 of them are old friends of the Doctor. One is Ace's paramour, who turns out to be hiding rather dark secrets. And one is a police officer who keeps arresting Hex and the Doctor on the mere suspicion that they may be connected to the murders, which makes her rather annoying. Trevor Bannister as Corbin Thesiger is the standout. He's come a long way since Are You Being Served, and he gives one of his final performances as an eccentric old composer. For the first time in these audios, there are also behind-the-scenes interviews with the cast, as they talk about their characters and the joys of audio work, and we also get to hear what McCoy and Aldred thought of the 2005 TV show as well. Overall, rather average, nothing to get excited about. The Dark Husband is certainly unique. The writer David Krontik is known for writing comedy, so there's a lot more humour here than usual, but not all of it works. The Doctor, Ace and Hex travel to Tuin for their infamous festival, only to find themselves in the middle of a war between the Ree and the Ear. One race is bald, the other extremely hairy. The only way to stop the war is for the Doctor to become the Dark Husband and marry the Shining Bride, although he has no idea what any of that means. Ace and Hex get roped in as well, and the 3 of them have to navigate their way through the bizarre alien rituals and try and find out what's really going on. The regulars are all slightly out of character throughout, competing with each other to make quips and puns. Hex suffers the worst as he's turned into a typical lad just out to get drunk, which is very far from his usual depiction. But at least his crush on Ace hasn't been forgotten, and there's a poignant moment at the end relating to that. The guest cast is essentially just Danny Webb, who plays the main representatives of the Ear and the Ree, as well as a mystery character who shows up at the end to explain the plot.
Or he's a barbarian warrior who sounds like Brian Blessed.
and it is supercilious and condescending, and rather like one of Jason Watkins' characters. To his credit, he does a good job of making them both sound very different, and I would not have guessed they were played by the same actor, though I'm really not sure why they did it. The final part brings in some big SF concepts in a sub-Douglas Adams kind of way. It makes up for some of the silliness of before, but you feel like they could have introduced them a bit earlier to balance things out. It's a flawed play, but an interesting one, and the interviews with the cast and Quantic at the end are certainly worth a listen. 45 is a collection of 4 half-hour stories by different writers, all linked by the number 45 and produced to mark the show's 45th anniversary. The second one is the weak link, but the other stories are all very strong, with some notable guest performances and enough development in the ongoing story arc to make it essential listening. False Gods has a big guest appearance by Benedict Cumberbatch as the archaeologist Howard Carter, recorded shortly before he started playing Sherlock and his career took off. He gives a solid performance, but nothing spectacular. It would have been more interesting if he played a villain. The story itself has the TARDIS crew visiting one of his pre-Tutankhamun digs, only to be shunted into different time periods from the far future to the distant past. And there's a surprising reveal towards the end that leads to a tragic ending, with Sylvester McCoy giving one of his trademark rants at the injustice of it all. Short, but very good. Order of Simplicity starts out with a traditional horror story scenario, as the Doctor, Ace and Hex visit a creepy old house on a dark and stormy night to find a mad scientist engaged in bizarre experiments, a housekeeper with secrets, and 2 monsters in the 3rd floor bedroom. It's an atmospheric start, but sadly it goes off the rails with numerous big ideas brought up in quick succession and no real time to develop any of them. So it's probably the weakest of the set. Casualties of War feels like the most important of the 4 instalments, at least in terms of the characters. Paul Reynolds from Press Gang plays another dodgy character, this time a Spiv, just after the end of World War II, who steals alien technology from the Forge and gets into all sorts of trouble. It feels more like a period Torchwood story at first, but it soon becomes apparent that his character is Ace's uncle, and this is a sequel to The Curse of Fenric, with Ace meeting her young mother once more. Sophie Aldred plays the emotional scenes very well, and there's also strong material for Hex, as he nearly finds out about the Doctor's past with his mother, but not quite. Another fine instalment. The Word Lord has another classic setup, with an impossible mystery for the Doctor to solve in an Antarctic base in the far future. But it's no standard murder mystery, as the culprit turns out to be a being from another dimension. Paul Reynolds is back, this time playing the Word Lord, a mysterious otherworldly creature who uses people's everyday speech against them and is as powerful as he is malevolent. It's a great idea for an audio, but the half-hour format means it doesn't have much time to go into the implications. The ending in particular is a little abrupt, as the Doctor seems to defeat the Word Lord a bit too easily, but of course he does come back in the future. There are also 2 batches of cast and crew interviews, with Benedict Cumberbatch talking about his mother's appearances in Doctor Who, and Paul Reynolds talking about Press Gang. So it's a fine package overall, with plenty of variety and stories that never drag on. The Magic Mousetrap is written by Matthew Sweet, who is perhaps better known for doing all the long interviews on the Blu-ray collections. He certainly knows his Doctor Who, bringing back a classic villain in a new context, and as a writer, he's very successful. The play is beautifully constructed and full of witty dialogue, and it's definitely one of the high points of this run. The opening has an amnesiac Doctor waking up in a cable car en route to a remote hospital in 1920s Switzerland. When he gets there, he meets the patients, all eccentric to one degree or another, and investigates the mysterious death of the faculty doctor. So it's basically a cure for wellness 7 years before that movie even came out, or more likely an adaptation of The Magic Mountain, a book which I haven't read. Throughout the first episode, the listener is left to wonder what has happened to Ace and Hex. At the end, we find out that they are present, but they are affecting upper-class accents and pretending to be different people. Sophie Aldred is much better at this than Philip Olivier, but that might just be a character choice. It soon becomes clear that they are orchestrating the whole situation and trying to prevent the Doctor from finding out what's really going on, which is a fun new dynamic for the central trio, as normally it's the Doctor manipulating the others. At the end of part 2, we get the big reveal that a classic Doctor Who villain is behind it all. I won't spoil it in case anyone plans on listening, but it's a whole different take to the TV version, which still makes sense, and it's a very clever way to do a sequel. It's also established that there was a whole adventure before this one, which we did not hear, and this situation is all part of the aftermath, so the listener has to try and piece together what happened before. In the guest cast, we get Nadine Lewington as plucky young Queenie Glasscock, who is essentially the Doctor's companion for most of the story, and is similar to Charlie Pollard, plus Paul Anthony Barker as the wonderfully named Ludovic Comfort. Overall, a very clever play with smart writing and some great ideas, highly recommended for all fans of the show. Enemy of the Daleks is another all-action war story, but thankfully it's set on the future in another planet. And it features the Daleks, so it feels very different to the historical war stories from earlier in the run. The setting is the planet Bliss, once a paradise, but now a jungle full of dangerous plants and ferocious insects in the middle of the Dalek War. Even the Doctor wants to leave this time, but instead they end up in a research base with a mad scientist, the remains of an army unit, and Daleks on the way to slaughter them all. The Doctor spends most of his time dealing with Professor Shimura and his creation, the Kasabian, a deadly monster created to destroy Daleks, but which turns out to be just as dangerous to humans. We never get a real sense of what they look like, but both humans and Daleks are horrified by them, and if it had ended differently, you can imagine a sequel where they both team up to defeat their mutual enemy. Shimura has obvious parallels to Davros, which are explicitly brought up, as the Doctor muses on whether he made the right choice back then, and whether he should do the same with this new threat. He is at his coldest and most dangerous here, and McCoy relishes the chance to cut loose, particularly in scenes where the Black Dalek begs him for mercy. Ace here is closer to how she was in the New Adventures novels, where she spends years fighting against the Daleks. This is never explicitly referenced, whether for rights reasons or just to keep it simple, but she certainly seems very confident with the weapons and technology of this era, and Sophie Aldred seems to enjoy playing this Ace more than usual. Hex, meanwhile, gets his first taste of the Daleks and absolutely hates it. He even gives away the Doctor's presents to them to save his own skin. Controversial, perhaps, but in those circumstances I would probably do the same thing. At the end, he even starts to doubt whether he wants to keep on travelling in the TARDIS at all, which plays out over the next few stories. Of the guest cast, Kate Ashfield from Shaun of the Dead plays Lieutenant Beth Stokes, who goes through a lot of trauma during the story and even has a full mental breakdown at one point. The actress does a great job of playing a complex character. Overall, it's a solid sci-fi action story, nothing groundbreaking, but a fine listen. The Angel of Scutari is yet another historical war story, but it's a step above the others in this run. All the regulars have exciting storylines, there are some fine guest performances, and the non-linear storyline makes it complex but rewarding, so it's highly recommended. Following on from last time, the Doctor brings Hex to the Crimean War, so he can put his nursing skills to use and feel like he's making a difference. Hex tries to save lives using anachronistic technology, breaking all the rules, but he does get to meet Florence Nightingale, his nursing idol. Meanwhile, the Doctor finds the only way to preserve the timeline is for him to be arrested as a Russian collaborator, and he has to try and pull it off without being executed. And Ace has a somewhat lighter storyline, meeting Leo Tolstoy and indulging in a will-they, won't-they relationship, so she probably has the best time of all of them. It's a similar kind of story to what you get in the early historicals, but it's told out of order, so it feels much more up-to-date. And there is time travel involved, so you need to pay attention to how all these various parts fit together. I don't know much about the period, but it all feels authentic enough, and it certainly fulfills the show's original educational remit, while being a really fun and well-told story at the same time. The big guest star is Hugh Bonneville, before he got the Downton Abbey role. He plays Sir Sidney Herbert, an English officer, as you might expect, but also Tsar Nicholas I, who at this point in time is a sick old man, which really gives him the chance to show his range. Jeannie Spark is Florence Nightingale, portraying her with depth and sympathy, and Alex Lowe is Barty Kitchen, who becomes obsessed with capturing the Doctor. He seems a bit one-dimensional until the end, until he discovers his big secret and it all falls into place. Overall, it's an absolute gem. Project Destiny is the audio equivalent of the big all-action season finale, bringing long-standing storylines to a head and providing a major turning point in the relationship between the regulars. It's full of action and big dramatic moments, so for anyone who's been following the Forge storyline, it makes for a satisfying ending. This picks up right where the Angel of Scutari left off, with Hex wounded, Ace and the Doctor taken back to the hospital where they first met him, in the far future year of 2026. You can buy calendars for that now. Unfortunately, London has been overrun by parasitic aliens, who are a bit like Xenomorph, but even more unkillable. Luckily, the Forge has gone public and turned into a unit-style military organisation, unlike the Proto-Torchwood they were before. Hex recovering at the Forge makes the first 2 episodes extremely tense, with the ever-present danger that he might find out what happened to his mother, which the Doctor still hasn't told him about for no apparent reason. The big confrontation doesn't happen until part 3, but when it does, it is appropriately explosive, with everyone pointing guns at each other, and it seems the Doctor and Hex's relationship has irretrievably broken down. Sylvester McCoy successfully portrays the Doctor's angst and regret over his actions, and Philip Olivier's Hex is an outpouring of emotions, of hurt and betrayal, and it's heartbreaking if you've been following the characters all this time. The final part is even more apocalyptic, as the final strike against the aliens takes out the Forge for good, while the Doctor tries to stop Hex from doing something very stupid with his mother's remains. And it ends on yet another cliffhanger. The guest cast contains some familiar names. Ingrid Oliver, who would go on to play Osgood in the TV series, starts out playing an unfortunate victim of the aliens, but then goes on to play the voice of the computer. Not really one of her best roles. Maggie O'Neill plays Lysandra Aristides, no-nonsense soldier type, very different to her best-known role as Phil Mitchell's girlfriend in EastEnders. And Stephen Chase returns as Nimrod, now the respectable head of a public organisation, but he returns to his usual cackling villainy by the end. Overall, it's a strong end to the Forge trilogy. It might make more sense to those who've listened to the earlier installments, Project Twilight and Project Lazarus, but there's enough explanation given that even if you haven't, it should still make sense. The alien threat is a bit undeveloped, they don't even get a name, but they're not really that important in the long run. The real story is with the Doctor and Hex, and that certainly delivers. A Death in the Family is the triumphant conclusion to years of Big Finish audios. It writes out one regular character, while giving the other regulars meaty stories of their own, as well as being a complex and satisfying story in its own right. It's an incredible piece of work, and one of Big Finish's best. It starts right where Project Destiny left off, with Hex leaving the Doctor as he investigates mysterious Time Lord coffin, which contains an older version of himself, i.e. the Seventh Doctor. It soon turns out that the Word Lord is back, played by Ian Reddington, who also played the Chief Clown in The Greatest Show in the Galaxy. He gives a magnificent performance here, managing to be funny and charming, as well as utterly psychopathic. He would have made a great master. The structure of the story is rather unusual. After the shock ending of Part 1, which I will not spoil, we get separate storylines for Hex and Ace in Parts 2 and 3. Hex is deposited on an alien world, where he meets Evelyn Smythe, and he finally gets some closure for his mother's death from somebody who actually knew her. It is a bit jarring that Evelyn is on a different planet to when she last appeared, but this is explained eventually, and Maggie Stables is as good as ever. The planet they are on has a kind of techno-medieval feel to it, with a complex religion, where a story speaker ensures that everything that happens is recorded for generations to come, and it is forbidden to research the origins of their civilization, which of course Hex does, with his new girlfriend, Yale San. It allows him to have an extended break from the Doctor, and gives him time to decide if he really wants to stop travelling with him after all. Ace's episode also allows her to experience regular life without the Doctor, getting herself a boyfriend called Henry Noon, who I assumed was the Word Lord in disguise, but the twist is a lot cleverer than that. Sophie Aldred also gets to play an older, more intelligent version of the character, and she feels much more at home here than when she's trying to play the younger Ace. It's a shame this version couldn't have stuck around. In the end, all the different plot lines come together neatly, revealing it's all been part of a complex trap to finish off the Word Lord for good. His final confrontation with the Doctor is a real high point, one arch manipulator turning the tables on another. And before that, we get a wonderful scene where Evelyn calls out the Doctor for everything he's been up to, like a headmistress admonishing a naughty schoolboy. Really, the Sixth Doctor should have been there for her final appearance, but it doesn't matter. It's a really emotional scene anyway. Overall, it's a fitting end to this run of stories, and also the larger run stretching back to the Six and Evelyn era. There are still about a dozen more with this TARDIS crew, and I might go back and finish them at some point. But I gather Hex does not get a happy ending, so I'm in no rush to find out what happens. And this is certainly a satisfying place to leave them for the moment. Thank you for watching. You could have read these reviews weekly on my Patreon, where I've been posting them for the past few months. And I will be carrying on with more audio reviews. Once I've watched the Paul McGann TV movie, I'll start to review his audio adventures, starting with Storm Warning and going forwards, so we'll see how far I get. And I'll be posting my reviews on Patreon once a week, and doing video roundups on here every few months. Next week on this channel, the first part of my journey through Doctor Who's wilderness years, as I cover some exciting projects that happened before the TV movie. So join me for that, and I'll see you next time.